Hi guys, welcome back to JC Jog Support. In today's video I'm going to be going through some ways that you can answer 12 markers. And this is from feedback that I got a couple of weeks ago from the Edexcel examiners where they looked at the summer exams, and I did some training, and so I'm going to kind of go through what they told us as teachers. So if we get straight on with it, this is for 12 markers, but it can actually be adapted to 20 markers as well for those questions on coasts, and superpowers is 12, isn't it? Health and human rights, or if you do the other topics that have 20 markers. So one thing that the examiner said was that quite often over the last couple of years, the question has said, to what extent does a factor, or to what extent is a factor important? So that's your starting point is the factor that they give you. So for example, if you were doing rivers, or let's say you were doing water security, that which I'm teaching at the moment, and it might say, to what extent is geology the most important factor, or to what extent is heavy rainfall the most important factor in flooding in a drainage basin, etc. So you would look at that factor first, and then you would look at subsequent factors. So that's how you would kind of break down the question. So the other thing that they told us, which was quite interesting, was that you don't really need an introduction. So you kind of like get straight into it. Now you're probably quite used to writing an introduction, and if you still want to write a very brief introduction, just saying there are many factors that have an impact on a drainage basin, that's okay, but don't spend a lot of time doing that, because they were saying that you don't really get an awful lot of marks, if any marks, for an introduction, which was kind of quite interesting. So if you get straight into it, the first paragraph you're going to write about is the factor that they give in the question. So for example, in that instance, it could be, to what extent is geology the most important factor in a drainage basin? So you would write the first paragraph. So you would give a little bit of background to geology and what the impact was, and that will be AO1. So that will be your content. But remember, in a 12 marker, that AO1 is only worth 3 marks and AO2 is worth 9 marks. So most of what you write has to be evaluation or assessment of the points. That's really, really, really important. So I would do the first part of the paragraph. You could write a little bit about geology and how it impacts it, and then get straight into how important geology is with some evaluative statements. So really, just like geology is very important because this can be seen in, and you can use your case studies, some of your facts and figures in your case studies, to justify the point that you think geology is the most important factor, or whatever else you're writing about in maybe it's superpowers, maybe it's another topic as well, maybe it's coasts, whatever. So you need to say, most of that paragraph needs to be taken up by evaluative comments to tell the examiner how important and to what extent that factor is important. When you've done that, that's your first paragraph. You go on to your next paragraph, will be another factor. So it could be something like land use. So it could be a human factor. So it could be urbanization, okay, or deforestation, or channelization of the river, etc., river management. So you give your next factor, and you say, again, you just very briefly talk about the AO1, what is that factor, and then you start talking about, is it more or less important than the previous factor? So to what extent is the factor now that you're talking about more important or less important than geology? And again, use those evaluative comments. Okay, so this next factor is more important because, or this next factor is less important because. And again, use your facts and figures from your case studies to kind of justify and exemplify your next point. Then you go on to the next factor. If it's 12 mark, you're probably going to need like 3 factors, probably the main factor and another 2, because otherwise you can't look to what extent if you don't have more than maybe 1 or 2. So you, again, the same thing, you follow this same format again. So you choose your next factor, and then you say how important that factor is. So maybe this factor is an important factor, but definitely not as important as the first factor that you've talked about. And again, use your case study detail to exemplify this. The examiner will be looking for the 12 marks. He'll be looking for facts and figures. So you don't want to just write quite generic points here, because you'll probably only get like 6 or 7 marks for that, probably maybe 7 or 8. But if you start kind of peppering in some case study detail, then you'll start moving up into the kind of next band of marks. So you do that for your next factor, and then your final conclusion, you will go back to the question and you'll kind of say, which was the most important factor. Now, they did say you don't necessarily need a conclusion, but I think, to be honest, if you've got time, I would just write a couple of sentences at the end to kind of like just overall say if you agree or disagree with the statement. So, because it does say to what extent is whatever it is, geology the most important factor in a drainage basin, you know, that causes flooding or whatever. So you do, I think that you maybe need to have a couple of evaluative statements at the end to weigh up which factor is the most important. And the other thing that they say sometimes is to add a little bit more, another kind of fact or figure. Nothing, no new thing, okay, not a new factor, but for the factor that you've chosen, or the first factor, whether it is or not the first factor, use another piece of information that you can add to it to substantiate that point. So to recap, most of the questions will say to what extent is. You come up, you answer the question, don't need a massive introduction, point out to what extent that factor is important. Is it the most important factor or not? And then your subsequent paragraphs will be other factors and you saying whether that factor is more or less important than the factor that you started with. And then in the end, you'll kind of summarise and say, actually, yes, you know, geology is the most important factor. Or you say, no, actually, you know, the amount of rainfall in the drainage basin or the urbanisation in the drainage basin, that's the most important factor. And you make sure that you use your case study facts and figures. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to do another couple of videos where I'll take a couple of questions and I'll kind of like briefly lay out what you would do to exemplify this, but I hope that makes sense. You can change this as well for a 20 marker, because a 20 marker will be evaluate, which, to be honest, you know, as long as you've got ongoing evaluation. So again, at the bottom, if you're picking out the most important factor, you know, this format works for a 20 marker as well. So it works for an assess question, it works for an evaluate question as well. But with a 20 marker, you'd probably have 4 decent points, and with a 12 marker, you'd have probably 3. But for the 20 marker, obviously those points would have to be better developed, because it is a 20 marker. It's kind of like not quite double, but it's almost double the amount of points there, isn't it, or marks. So you'd have to exemplify it to a greater degree, or use your BLT structure to widen what you're talking about. So this is because, this leads to, therefore, so you'd use that BLT structure to kind of make those points a lot more complex, if you see what I mean. Your arguments will be a lot more complex. But again, you would use your facts and figures. So that is to answer 12 markers for assess.